Hello class, this is a continuation of trigonometric equations, and in the last video we did two examples showing how multiple solutions could exist for trigonometric equations, and I'll just be doing the remaining examples here now. Okay, so let's get right to it. Tan of x equals -1. So normally you would want to do this, the inverse of tan of -1, but my piece of advice is actually figure out what it is in the first quadrant, meaning just take everything as positive first. So let's take a look. Tan of inverse 1 is 45 degrees. I'm not going to write this as 45 because tan of 45 is +1. We want -1. Now, how we figure out where it is for -1? Well, let's consider where tan is negative in which quadrant. So, in the first quadrant, all values are positive. In the second quadrant, only sine is positive, meaning tan is negative here. So we want this 45 degrees, but the angle we are looking for is this one. Well, that would be 180 degrees, take away 45. So that's our first solution. 180 take away 45 is 135. That is one solution. And another quadrant where tan is negative, well, it's not the third quadrant because tan is positive here. Another quadrant where tan is negative is the fourth quadrant. So we'd want an angle like this, where that's 45, but we need to measure this angle beginning from the initial. So this is going to be 360 take away 45 degrees. So 360 take away 45 is 315. So again, just to really illustrate the point, so we can test this. We can go tan of 135 and tan of 315. If we did this correct, both answers should be -1. And we are correct. Moving right along. Okay, so now that we have a function or more operations going on in the left-hand side, there's not really an inverse sign that we can do. But what we do actually is we treat this as a regular equation, meaning I'm going to be moving that -1 first, meaning it's going to be equaling +1. And then I'm going to be dividing by 2. So sine x equals half. And at this point, now we take the inverse of sine of half, which I know already to be 30 from my exact values. So that's 30 degrees. And that's in the first quadrant. Another quadrant where sine is positive is in the second quadrant. So we're going to do 180 take away 30 degrees. That's 150. Again, you can always check your solution in a calculator. So both of these answers should give me half. And 0.5 is half. 4 cosine squared equals 3. Well, we solve this like we would a regular equation. We're going to divide by 4 first on both sides, which will give us cosine squared x is equal to 3 on 4. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. This will give us cosine x by itself plus or minus the square root of 3 and the square root of 4, which gives us root 3 on 2. X will now equal to the inverse of cos root 3 on 2. Now remember, this answer will only give us the first quadrant, so cosine inverse root 3 on 2. If you remember your exact ratios, this should be 68, nope, 30, I was wrong, 30 degrees. And once again, this is only in the first quadrant. But if we take a look at the answers we need positive or minus root 3 on 2. So that means all the quadrants are a valid solution. So we have this answer here of 30. We also need it in this quadrant here. That's 180 minus theta. That's going to be 150. We need it in this quadrant here of 30 degrees, measuring it like this. That's going to be 180 plus theta. That's going to be 210. And lastly, we need it in the fourth quadrant, like this, where that's 30 degrees. But we need it all the way around like that, which is 360 minus 30, which is 330. Once again, if we test these answers, cosine 30, cosine 50, cosine 210, and cosine 330. Okay, now it may not look like root 3 on 2, but let's take a look at what happens when we input that in. It is the same value, and cosine of 150 and cosine of 210 are giving the negative values of root 3 on 2, which is what we want. Last two examples here. Let me move this down so we can utilize it. Also, I advise you guys to have one of these drawn in your book that you can use to either scribble on with pencil and you can rub out, or you can just visualize the triangles. All right, moving right along. 2 tan squared x equals 2. Let's eliminate this 2 first by dividing by 2 on both sides, giving us tan squared x equals 1. Because remember, dividing by 2 on both sides. Taking the square roots of both sides, leaving us with tan x equals plus or minus 1. And now we're going to take the inverse of only the first quadrant, square root of tan inverse of 1. Well, x is equal to, I know this one to be 45. But now take a look, because it's plus or minus 1, we want this triangle, because that's positive 1 for tan. We want this angle of 45, because that's negative 1 for tan, because remember, sine is positive in the second quadrant. But we want that angle there, which is 180 minus 45, which is 135. We want this angle here, like this. That's going to be 180 plus 45, that's 225. And lastly, we want it in the fourth quadrant, that 45 degrees. Tan in this quadrant will be negative, so we want this angle there. So that's going to be 360 take away 45. I can't do that in my head right now. 315. Once again, always checking your solutions. Tan 45, tan 135, tan 225, and tan 315. All of them plus or minus 1. One last example here. Now this one may look very tricky because we have two values of sine, two trigonometric ratios, sine and cos. A little trick here that you can do is, well, really we should only be working with one for now. So what I'd like to do is actually eliminate cosine That way, I'm left with root 3. And how I'm going to be doing that is I'm going to be dividing both sides by cosine of x. 0 divided by cosine of x, well, that's just 0. Sine divided by cos is actually tan of x from our trig ratios, plus cosine of x divided by cosine of x, well, that's eliminated, leaving us only with root 3 is equal to 0. Now we're going to move the root 3 to the opposite side. Tan of x equals negative root 3. Now if we do the inverse of tan to solve for positive root 3, because we'll just take a look at this in the first quadrant, tan inverse of root 3 at 60 degrees in the first quadrant. That is not a solution, however, because we want negative root 3. I've inputted positive root 3. The reason why I did that is just so that I can visualize this in the first quadrant. So that's 60 degrees like this. That is not a solution. What we want is where tan is negative. So if we did it in the second and fourth quadrant, tan would be negative. So we want this angle here of 60 degrees, but always measuring from the initial. So that's going to be 180, take away 60, that's 120. And we want it in this quadrant here, where that's 60 degrees. But remember, always measuring from the initial. So that would be 360, take away 60, which is 300. And lastly, checking our solution. Tan of 120 and tan 300. These two answers should give us square root of negative square root of 3. Once again, we don't know whether or not that's root 3, but we can test by typing it in, and it's matching. So I hope that gave you an insight into trigonometric equations through some more examples. Hope to see you in the next video. Best of luck.